학생연도 아데니야 로장수기 림바데 아니 델야네 기위 신인 된수지 마슈 엔딘마 안마 저기 된주율리된디에 나 자침보 뒤딘 자침보 임바디 고마슈 바렉스 된주율리된 세야디 간 칠레 고레세야다 아니 뭐다 디니에가 와다 규리카르레 세데 안디 디고란즈 계신슈버와.
Good evening. So we're continuing to look at the crucial part of the Lama Chöpa, which is the graduated stages of the path to enlightenment. A couple of weeks ago we looked at the first, being relying on one's spiritual teacher. Then last week we looked at the foundational training of looking at the rebirth that we've achieved, this precious human rebirth. What is its entity and why it is so precious, in other words, its potential. And we looked at its great rarity as well as the causes that lead to this rebirth. This evening we continue with the next verse, which is continuing within the presentation on trainings that are shared with practitioners of initial capacity. Verse 86. Please bless me to fear the searing blaze of suffering in the three lower realms, take heartfelt refuge in the three precious gems, and enthusiastically practice avoiding negative actions and accumulating virtue. If we divide samsara, or certainly the desire realm, into two, it would be into those classified as higher realms and those as lower realms. The higher realms refers to rebirth as humans or gods, and the lower realms refers to rebirth as an animal, as a spirit, or as a hell being. One often may come across the term six migrators or six class of migrators. So that would then be, if we expand the higher and lower realms, with the higher realms encompassing not just gods and humans, but gods are also can be subdivided into gods and demigods, and then humans. So three categories of beings in the high realms, and then those three categories or three types of beings in the lower realms of animals, spirits, and hell beings. The sixfold division is differentiated in terms of the levels of suffering. So gods experience so much happiness compared to humans. But in between is another class of god called the demigod, who do not experience nearly as much happiness as a god, but significantly more happiness than a human, and therefore significantly less suffering than a human. So this is how one divides the god realm into the class of gods and demigods.
나 저기 미들에네 담이 베네 샤르리바보 세다 디 샤르리바보를 미세다 데네 로잠블링이 미세 장담면이 미세다 누방란주 미세다 대지상 베네 샤르호 링시여버서 링시를 내되게인데다 아 저기 지게 미로스 마선의 미래 아니 미라미라 대선 마선의 시리 용거를 제로다.
And traditionally, the human realm is also divided in terms of the 4 different continents in traditional cosmology. So if you think of the mandala offering, they are named there, the 4 continents as well as the 8 subcontinents. And this is a division amongst humans.
지게 유럽시아다 샤쇼바시아다 디네지 대세망부 디나래야 지게 링텐 망부 디나데 링텐 지나래야 개합지지 개합망부 디네 대세망부로 와디 미나래 다 디네인자 디나신 지나가 저기 장안 저기 대선 지나 제는 가서 호점블링 미시 대선 지나 주로 이내 디나로야 대세망부 요시로와 안 디나신다 맞이 밀라요도 안 대선디 지야도 대선 밀라는 지다 대선 직체 Dina Yawa Chedina Sharlingi Misa, Roy Tumbling Minu Palachu, Jantami Misa, the meat Dusene Kaha Chayo, Desan Maso Kavach, Desan Kaha Yorua.
So in traditional cosmology, we are on the southern continent, as human beings, on the southern continent called Sampuling. And this is amongst the 4 great continents and the 8 subcontinents. And we can understand that by saying our world is divided itself into 7 continents, which are all subdivided into many different countries. So this is the way we divide humans, but in terms of traditional cosmology, it's into the 4 major continents with their 8 subcontinents. And I mentioned earlier that gods can be divided into 2 gods and demigods. There's another way to divide gods. So the division of gods and demigods, we can include those within the desire realm. Then there's another class of gods from the form realm, and then a 4th class of god are the formless realm gods. So in this way, gods can be divided into 4. Those gods of the formless realm, the gods of the form realm, and amongst the desire realm gods, there's the 2 divisions of desire realm gods and desire realm demigods.
Dila demo ya barnan kala ne tu ge la sa da de ne ge da desen ma so man jugi ka so geshin rishi se la sa ja rishi la sa sum sa sum la sa da de ne ya an barnan kala ya tha da da ga den tu ge xian tu wang jie sa de ne ge that ming da de desen ma so ba je ne desen nga zo sal ka ne bi ge an ne la de bi ka sa de bi la jik je Sagalmane Banangala Nedingi Hadisen Sumina Giore, Sumina Banangala Nedigan. Sagala Dadinga, Sagala Nedigan, Laji Dubelaje, Sawoli Kishme, the Sagal Salagan Dindigan, and Sagala Company of Dugoro Dinashi, Salad, the Muling Salad Dindigan, Haji, de Dubel Haji Gore. That is Salam Tim Roja Banangala, and Nedigan. 아니 제가 대선 숨심고래 제가 다다 가든 추가 현조 대선 시요래 언제내게 다 대별할 때내게 다 대선 대별할 집에 대선가 차르고래 대별할 때내 대선가 차기래 제 바나사강을 많이 봐지 바나가를 요디게 대선 시요래 제다 사강을 내든가 하요로와 대별할 때 대선 직지도 대선가 차르고래 제 그래서 말 사강을 되게 하지 요르와 살람때 뭐지 바나가를 내 되게 할 가지고 림바 시요래 제 시 하래 자산 하래데 자산 하기 대선 마선의 시요래 제 바나가를 내 되게 할 시요래 제 시요래 제 디간라네 사강라네 디간 하지거로 하주 되벨 하요로 딘넘버게 dom현에 가서 차기래 나차로 와 시간을 직넘버게는 가로와 이로와 디니기 요 되벨라
Another way that gods of the desire realm are divided, so we heard about one division into two. So another way to divide gods of the desire realm is into five. So there are four different classes of those who live in space or in the sky, and there is the fifth will be those who live on or above the earth. So this would be a fivefold division of desire realm gods.
자다 디니기 다 되벨 할 집에네 사강라 네딩 할 집에네 아직 초망고지 대신대세 망고지여로 다디 간제레 만주기 된줄 집에네 되벨 하다 안에 수디기라 수미기라 세지 라숨지 안디간라 되비 미세지제 대수차상 된로세 다 망안줄 집에네 냐와다 이다 된로세 숨지 다 제사다 나주기 개와 렌세데 가와 간주 레다 뇽모 왕기 개와 렌세기 니데 가와 가라 해서 디수레다 제사 간주 레다 뇽모 개와 렌데리아 가제 요르스네 간조 숨냐와 이다 둔돌레 개와레 사주 조설 마선 숨묘레 안디간레 된돌레 있나다 밀기야제 안에 살레게 하대한 되별하다 수결하다 수미결하 안데네기 조사로 당아주 개설 마선에 개월 렌설 마선에 단내 디네딘 요래 사지 순거로와.
In some texts also, the desire realm gods abiding on earth, these are many subdivisions. So from this you can tell there are many ways to classify beings. The most common way though is into those in the high realms or the upper realms and those into the lower or suffering realms. And the most common divisions within that of the higher realms will be the desire realm gods, or just gods perhaps, including form and formless realm, as well as humans. And then in the lower realms, it's the threefold division of animals, spirits, and hell beings. Why this is to be understood is it's within these places of rebirth that one is reborn due to one's previously accumulated karma and afflictions. So due to or under the power of one's karma and afflictions, one takes rebirth in one of these realms.
다 이다 나래 코노도 대신 망보요래 난 둔도 나래 대신 망보요로 받아 좁게서 니감 좁게서라.
And also the texts present many subdivisions in the low realms. For example, the 18 hell realms, as well as subdivisions among spirits and so forth.
나 되네 인자다 당한주 통해야 냐와다 이다셔야 된한주 통고 말해 당한주 가르 통고서 눈으로 통고로 봐. 당한주 눈으로 통고래. 눈으로 나래 한주 통한 투게 눈으로다 통마투게 눈으로 망고래. 제배는 수유eken 눈으로 되게 한주 통고로 수매비게 눈으로 망고래. 디성한주 통투고 말아 봐.
Of these differing realms, it's really two that we are most familiar with, that of humans and animals. Within animals, though, there are those which we are familiar with, and then there are those animals which we are still unfamiliar with, either those with form that are yet to become known to us, as well as those which don't have form and therefore are unseen and are unknown to us.
그래서 아주게 통투예게 둔로들다 가르쳐선 바티릭다 말아직다 둔로들 쇼제바된 아주게 수구예겐 아주 통되바달랑 다 쇼쇼로 받아 오늘 미라 망보 더는 수구예바나 계속 띵디와데 되는 아주 통마도와 싸워나 유딩 아주 통마도와 되는 망보여 봐 릭semjen 사발 마통한 제가 되네기 semjen다 두스체네 릭다 말아 유딩에 차기로 봐.
If we were to classify animals, this would be countless because there are so many different species, as well as new species still regularly being discovered, and not just in the depths of the ocean, but even on land, new species are still being discovered. So one could classify animals in really a very broad way, taking into account the wide breadth of species.
Dene inzada nganzu deli ma kar sumusa ngansong dunga barwi mechi ne sedo da chisa ngansong gi korshi gore ngansong siade chisa da deji ngansong siade nganzu nyawa ida dunru sumdi isi ngansong che chisa da nganzu kewa lensa drosal ma sona sachi dini yorasa pina nganzu kyagab chilo chilo dhogo na oda chige Erisea Gap Jore, Australia Gap Jore, England Europe Seda, and Jahasa, and Chigi, Denigi, Syrias, and Japine in the Mongores, Kikapti Motoshigora Tambo. That Motochine, Jahab Diludobana, and a Jig Tungen de Yabota, Shunga Tato Yabores. And Jahab Diludobana, Chidan or the Osores. And Jahab Dineta Bear, Yoras, Wakanga, but Chick Bear, Chick. And Chinangchu Mangbo Yora Ganga show your message. The Jahab Dinala Ganga Yore, Jahab Dinal, Jahab Yapunane Dinane Bed Yasho Dire Saji, go Motor says Yorwa. Just not that Kiran Jahab Naji Don Drew Wore, Kiran Jahab Dinale Kari Drag Deva Yores. Just not Kiran Kari Drova Devana, Kiran Jahab Dinal run the Dinekanga Din Yoreta, Jahab Dinal run the Tunkin Din the Yungre, Jahab Dinal Din Yakutato Yaku Yore said. Dichidu, Tanga to draw when I dinner the Karis draw the Ganzo Damgashi Wurwa. That Damgacha was that the Yaga de la Drovane and Chazan Drova Jila and Tunjendo Dachipa, Karakugu, Chazan Dedicho Chagurwa. Chazan Dinigi, Yagap in the Yores, Pesan Mason Dus to the Cije, Chazan Kuran Yagap Kawadroya de Yores, that the Kuran Ramares, that T. Droyage, Namduna, Jusavajela. Penny Papa Grimado Rawa Mares, and Namduna Zujeda, Pursana, and Pamalevena Rawa Marpini Maleva to Toyures, that they cannot Namduna Zuyo Marin Ticket Kanyoma, that they cannot Rawa, Dina Kawana, and to Recurrent Damgare, such Mansul Damgate as Yorua, Piramason, or Dina she Cesada, Nyawa Ida Dundro Sum said Dendro, Nandri didn't in the Yores. And Dendrugan Hada Mida Casal Hada Missage Yore, Hala need in it in the Yores. Chizan do Situda, and Nyawar Kinakan Kangadin in the Yores, Dundul Kinakangadin in the Yore, Idala Kinakangadin in the Yores, such Kangaki near Sumditika in the Yores. That didn't march Jananda, Milkevana, dinner in the Yores. Hanana and Dubel Halakin in the Yore. Sugil Hala Sulakina and Latikil dinner in the Yores. Sumipel Halakin dinner in the Yores. Atiko Korongi, Tungian, Dadina, the Antic Digi to Tata, Tungian Chazadi, Motochi Gore. Chazan dinner in Zada, the Motogene, Danga Zugim, Kiawachimadi, Kao to who you made it, Dadang around to Lavala Yodebare. Chazada. Yobanzang to get Ditoyag, Tablam Jedi, and Tashi de Jupu, Ditoyag, Dandala, that the Negi, that nearly near the Saji the motor shed, the Chigor, Chesa, Nasong Neti, the New York, said the motor shed, the Chigorwa.
Looking then at the first line in the text, please bless me to fear the searing blades of suffering in the lower realms. The lower realms, then, I've just mentioned, are classified as three: animals, spirits, and hell beings, and those can be classified in far more detail as well. But let's, before looking at this a little further, just take an illustration that we can all understand or relate to. So if one were to mention a number of countries, Australia, America, the UK, India, Syria, we could then, having mentioned those countries, we could then discuss their varying attributes, comment perhaps on their governance, the various conditions or situations that one would find oneself in if one were there, discussing in which ways each country is, what their attributes are. In some ways, how are they better, how are they worse? Because there's quite a bit of variety between nations in terms of if one were to move there, what would one expect? And if one were to move somewhere and were to have to move somewhere and had freedom of choice, and then when one were choosing where to go, one would look at what are the various conditions in the options before me, and then seeing what's better, what's worse, one will make a decision, Having made that decision, one will prepare before one embarks, because one will understand that when one gets off the plane in one's new country, one needs to be as well prepared as possible to make a success of one's opportunities. And the time to prepare is not reading brochures when one is on the aeroplane. Once the aeroplane takes off, it's too late. The time to prepare is now. Now one has the freedom to prepare for the eventuality of arriving at one's new home. So this then we can liken to future rebirths. One looks at the varying realms, the 3 lower suffering realms, but also the upper realms, the higher realms, because all of them have their variety of conditions, those attributes which are seen as more positive or desirable, and those which are seen as undesirable, and those certainly within the lower realms that are to be avoided at any cost. So these we need to understand, because in dependence on that knowledge of what will be experienced should rebirth be taken there, one will use the opportunity one has now to prepare. So here we use terminology to link to our teaching last week. We have the freedom to prepare now. We have the opportunity to prepare now. So these freedoms and opportunities we need to use well.
On the neza da delia karson nganso dunga berwi me chigni se da nganso se dele keba na dunga da kanga mongbo yore se da de chisa da bene nyawa se da chike dida se da nyawa le ya chik be kanga yoba kanga chesho de nyawa ba de kanga gidina kanga yode ba da ida de gele dele ne nyawa ba le to straga de gidina kanga yode ba re da dunro de gele dele to straga yode na kanga yode ba re se Nyawa ida se de nga tung go ma de dunro de nga zo tong tu ye che da dunro la kan ka kan stu se ba ne da pe nga zu ge nya ro chi sam ta be ne ma zo cha sa thong de ge cha nya de chu na le du go de ine ko le ya cha de pe mang bu shu shu ro da nya khong zu na lo pha chi sa ya ge ji go de ane dru ge sa go bya ba ge so ko nya sa kan ya pe chi thal ma so ne zhang mang bu shu ju de ge ane mi da semja shandayo dushin. Di najo dushin ko le chamangbo yo sa gidi ne ane chi so le nyanga chebo. Ane chi shenaro chi ngamda ro chi yue di ga de. Je dine kanga yung go re. Je dan khala sam marawi kanga. Ane di najin kabri le nima chawo gi chu gamro de chu me den de sa marawi kanga da. Dine ge ya chu na le da ba da nyok ba mongbo le di khong. Je je le kanga pa do me ba yue de ba chi che. nga zu nya la tan de ne yu de ga so cha gi do di men be da nga zu ge ta go yu de ge nga sem je de ge to ba da cha ba che de ni song gyup je ma tu ge ka nga yu de ge da ne za za ya ma re ka nga chu ma re ka nga cha be ka nga an ji ge cha yu ka nga de ne ge ka nga yu so su ge song gyup ka ya je tu ge ma ra da ka nga be du nga de nyo de ya ma da ka ya je tu ge ma ra wa sa je za da nga du nga dunrogi dunga jinga nga zugi tongsho su yuba samdana dine dine yore sayajida ngandroli keba yana dunga dine si yore kanga dine yore sayajida nga zuli ngotori chigi yorwada.
The sequence of the realms is presented from least suffering to most. So the suffering in hell is not only continuous but incredibly intense. The spirits suffer continuously too, but the intensity is less than in the hell realms, but still the suffering is worse than anything humans experience. And the animals is far less so, but we should start by looking at the suffering of animals because it's observable and relatable, understandable for us. Because all too often with animals we may look at them with eyes of affection, and see their position as quite calm and quite peaceful. But this is a mistake. Take the illustration of fish. So at a first glance, they may be very beautiful to look at, swimming around, seeming quite free. But the reality of their situation is anything but. They are surrounded by enemies. There's always the potential of a larger predator lurking around them. and there's nowhere really to go or to hide. And there's also the unknown danger of unexpected death, what we'd call fishing. Humans for sport or for commerce, catching them, taking their life by net or by spear or by hook. This danger is continuous and ever present. They don't know a moment of respite from this. Their lives are filled with continually searching for food and continuously being hunted. How to escape from such danger? And likewise with the unfolding disaster of the climate emergency, how do fish escape pollution? How do they escape the changing ocean temperatures, waters getting hotter and colder? Where do they turn for help, for assistance? They really are helpless and powerless. So in this way, when we look at animals and do so without the attachment of seeing them as cute and desirable, we come to understand just how pitiful their situation is. And this then can be our starting point to understand the situation for unseen beings.
장모 차바이나 가서 차와줘바나 룽구를 다제 디토네 세트고래 다 칼라 매바나 간저 칼라 답제 파파서 답제 지식 세트고요 바다 추매발레 추수에도 추된 두고요 바 칼라 매발라 룽베델라 칼라 매바나 룽베샤난 차워전제다 진에게 넘주서야 다 추제절라 지로메 배 간주 주불은 나서에 맨기 토네 안 나서 세트야 안지 샤셔 다제 나서 세트야 저장아주 밀이야 강아지 외도 요때 이내야 강아 세야리야 나저기 미기 남주에 당아주 미 리든 디토네야 강아 세야리야 안 탑람 시우지 베지 당토에 강아 세트고 그래서 제자다 랑 강아 세야 맞아 시한라야 강아 세야기 강아 세야 탑람 배 판도치 무슈지 두고 그래 스냐이네 현다지 강아지네 냐지기 로봇이 돼가요 말고 하면서 직다 둔도에나 따도야 마도 제라 단 마도 재미도 진짜 밀이야 아니 그 데니기 토네 로봇제 랑강아 세토야 현기 강아 수려 된지 미 연된데 룰리게 봐이나 제가 마줄야 배 동아 둔도다 미제베네 둔도데 미디 배 동아 뉴뉴 차고다 야자지베나 둔도기 야자 구비삼베나 밀리 야자 동아 야자 주스마도 메디가서 제가 밀리아 데니기 지금 미다 둔도니 제네 미디 배 마세 야고슈 다 디기 체와 안 강아시야 탑람슈 예딩에 차고 제자 미단 둔로 이지베나 다 냐와다 이다 둔로를 제번 미디샤라 야가래 해야지 다 야도기 다 개발 마서나 언두스진에 송고로와
Last week when we were discussing this precious human rebirth, one of the points that I emphasized was what makes this human rebirth so remarkable is our intelligence, and how this primarily is what makes us stand out amongst beings. And I mentioned last week, for example, because last week, like tonight, is particularly cold. But as human beings, based on our intelligence and thereby how we can use our body, we've invented so many wonderful things. We know how to make fire. We've also learned how to make warm clothing. Animals can't do that. We've learned how to make electricity and to use that electricity to generate heat and to do so safely in our homes. We've learned how to grow food that's better for us in winter, to generate heat within us. And we have commerce to make it easy to get the kinds of food we need, the kinds of food we want in the time of need. And then surrounding all of this, of course, with our human intelligence, we have and continue to invent incredible new technologies that are so helpful to humans, as well as ever-growing, improving medical treatment. So this is how, through our intelligence, humans can identify problems and solutions. Animals They struggle to resolve their problems, and they can only identify the causes of those. For example, climate change is known, and humans are trying to resolve this. But what can animals do? We as humans are trying to build safe and cooperative societies. Animals cannot do that. Really, there is no comparison between the sufferings that humans experience and animals. And similarly, there is no comparison between the suffering that spirits experience and animals, and there's no comparison between the suffering that hell beings experience and that of the spirits. There's a vast degeneration of suffering experienced by beings in the lower realms, in each of the realms progressively.
ane saya nganzu naji kala sawo saya da dulo gongo marwa chesa nganzu na chesa kala sa mogo inza kala saya gi dundala ane jigla ga mobo je hu ma chong ja hu mare ane ji go marwa je go mare chesa kanga shira chesa di namshi gyurdo ga kanga che go mare ane saya dong ya ge thone kanga yo mare ane ji pensun ma chu chupa ji la ji de ne ki chu bi ga ne 마견이 되네기 돈에 강아요말 제가 되네자 당아도 안 체인다 체정화래 제배 체정부 휴지리고 아주 밀리신의 체인의 령화 안 되네기 돈에 아주기 대비기 하다 미기 강아체배는 이니기 수기를 하되게 배시라게 아니 야요래서 제가 되네자 도시네 야고래 제네
When we look at the upward progression and we compare the situation of humans and gods, we'll see a vast difference. So we have some knowledge of certainly the coarser levels of suffering that human beings experience, such as illness, conflict, and the environmental harm that we're experiencing. And if we compare our situation to that of the form realm gods, so beyond the desire realm into the form realm, we can recognize how much more happiness they have, how their suffering is greatly reduced compared to us as human beings. They have no anger. The mental factor of anger is not developed, which means there is no conflict, there's no aggression, there's no violence. Moreover, they don't need coarse food for sustenance. So therefore they don't need to engage in any form of agriculture or any kind of food production. They don't need clothing for protection from the elements or for warmth. And their environment is flawless. It's not like ours. So they experience no harm from the environment. And then in addition, they have incredibly long lifespans. All of that sounds very desirable. We certainly do not have any of that here. In fact, those same things, such as afflictions, such as anger, the need for coarse clothing, environmental problems, conflict, all of this we experience readily. Whereas for form realm gods, these are completely absent.
gyudan kienji le tune kigo ma do gyudan kien me ba kigo ma res ro je sang zu mi de be gi mi dan la le ke wa le gyudan kien le tine kigo ma do gyudan kienji me ba ge yo ma je sang su gi la le ke ba le gyudan kien le tine kigo gyudan kien me ba ge yo ma je sang gyudan kienji le tune kigo ro ba je sang gyudan kien chen ji le tue je kigo ma do ma de ba ga ya ge yo ma le je ro da.
Whichever of these realms one takes rebirth, in fact, the situation of every single being in any of these realms has come about in the same way, independence on causes. It's independence on causes that each of us and each and every being has and will continue to take rebirth in their realm.
다 규단 긴래 되네 기교바이나 다디 송교체 투야치 투고로 받아 규단 변에 나솔 게디에 규단 긴실래 되네 기교바자나 규단 긴실래 되네 기교바자 규단 긴디 파가바나 고 게해 말아 송교체 투고로 봐 지단 규단 긴 매발지 기교네 송교체 해야 말다 타야 말게 되네 규단 긴 그거 말고 게래 제가 되네 인자 규단 긴 매발지 하면 규단 긴래 되네 기고 규단 긴래 되네 기와서 다 나솔이야 냐와 이다 dunrosumla 강가 되는 주요베나 델레 강가데 타야게 탑람 요래 말선 요래스 다 규단 긴래 되네 기고 제가 규단 긴디 가야게 탑람 요래스 그거 당하죠.
This is important to recognize, and to recognize clearly, because it means there's something that can be done. We are not helpless. If something comes about in dependence on causes, one can either strive to develop those causes or guard oneself from developing those causes. So recognizing that the suffering of the lower realms is intense and not wanting to experience it, we'll seek out to identify those causes and be sure to guard against accumulating them. So this is important to recognize. No rebirth is causeless. So therefore, we are not helpless. We are not powerless. There is something that we can do.
parwe mechi ne sidu ngaso nge dunga dene nang kanga dene yobane dene de mei chine de digimidu so manile de machi waje tawa jegogudu sambege dene ge samno chi ba ta chine ane de mai chine kanga duwa 제사 kanga yobasa kanga dingyon pe sasare 제사 kanga di manyo wa chigodu 제사 dene inza mane machi wa jegogudu samche mechi ne ane garche orasene 니니 권조스마 겹조싱사 권조스마 겹수 조고래 짬조시고래 제로와다 짬조시고래 제가 짬조 겹이 권조스마 때네 하는 가서는 맞게와디 제투그리스 짬요 권조스마 때네 나서라 맞게와디 제투그리스 제가 까투그리스 제가 인상 권조스마 야 권조스마 때네 나서스마 맞게와디 까투그 깨와디 까투그래 나서스마 맞게와 제투그리 제가 되네 인상 권조스마 짬조시고래스
Coming to recognize that the suffering in all three lower realms is incomparable to anything that humans experience. We'll generate a strong determination not to be born there. And not to be born there, we'll immediately seek refuge, protection. We'll turn towards the three jewels to seek their protection, because it's through their guidance that we can develop the causes to ensure that we do not fall into the lower realms. So here the verse continues, please bless me to fear the searing blaze of suffering in the lower realms and take heartfelt refuge in the three precious gems.
디게디언 권주숨나 데네지 투고레 기투고레스 다 밀레다 데벨하다 밀레 강아도 딜레데 수기야 할레케네 베깁서레선 베게 삼탄체 수르 할야 기와 삼베네 권주숨나 데네 아네가 수기 할야 기투고레 제산 디네자 권주숨나 데네 만주 덴톨레 기투고레 만주 기와데 가투고레 제산 권주숨리야 안지 닝네스 닝타관네 이체다 로데제제 안두시네 제데 겸로 제고레 디네 제 투고레 세제 디숨고로 와다
Here one turns towards the three jewels of refuge. Again, remembering this word refuge has the meaning of protection. Turns oneself to them for protection. Turns to them seeking guidance to be protected from accumulating the causes of falling to the low realms, and guidance to ensure that we only accumulate causes for achieving the rebirth that we desire, whether as a human being or a desire realm god or even a form realm god. The three jewels of refuge can protect us from the lower realms by guiding us how to develop the causes for good rebirth.
나는 권조 숨을 때네 간에스 만솔에 깨디 파가야다 미단 깨디 죽투야 안 할게 와디 건조 숨내는 용 투구이나 간스 용구래 람나 다 건조 숨내 산지 건조 최 건조 기준 건조 숨디 건조 숨으로 와다 지상 산지 건조 딜라 감나 샘진이 감나 뭐바 지다와신의 캔바 안에 탑람 간스 띵근의 땡바 땡의 캔바 안에 고알야 안균 탐지다 세와 윤된 탐지다 덴바 인자 제자다 나주래 녀와게 나송을 마제기 탑람 삼로 간에 간스 땅구도 세베 삼로디 건조 산지 건조게 마 숨고로와 람된지고래 징고래 안나가서 밀리게 바이나 안에 냠는 간에 간에 지고래서 디디 지바네 결혼 밀리기게래서 냠는 지다 림바디 산지기 숨고래 다겨 날할야 수길 하대야 수길 할야 깨바이나 냠는 간에 저런 딘딘딘 냠는 저 디제발레나 수길 할야 기게래서 데네게 탑람 아주기 된줄에 깨게 된줄에 네 강난 강래 깨게 하루 깨게 탑람디 안에 수딩을 상이 권축이 된샤요래 그래서 디된바디 아주 냠는 제야래 로바드 수지의 기능 권축이 아주 로체 그래서 다 두치는 아주 냠는 제네 상이 숨바 나신 아주 냠는 제 기능 권축 아주 로체 발에 냠 곰데 셈이 되도 곰 냠는 제야도 아주 길래야 제 람된다 곡된세디 안에 깨바이나 안에 가서 깨와를 바 탈고래스 나서 깨와라 탈고래 니기 깨와 치말이야 안에 하다미 깨와 이게 두고래제 나라 디송고를 다 가지고 건조 숨기 껴부리에서 껴타디 간스 껴부리에서 디르와 제단 최고조 세야디 상이유 숨시비 마 람든 제바딩 아주 냠는 제 기능 거 저기들 로바체네 아주 람 귤레게 아니 람된게 되는 곡된세 토바 있나 아니 곡된세 저러와 람된다 곡된 아주 이렇게 봐 있나 나선께라 탈고 알았어 나선께와 가사네 나선께 요 말이 되네 아니 디 나선을 맞게 봐나 제만께 인기고 봐되는 가와께 와서 수수기 약간들이한 밀게야다 아니 할게야디 니 하다 밀게야마도 시게야마 디날 기록을 해시로 제가 디제자 상기 순지가 람든 제바데 냠는 제반 나선을 깨와라 타 되네 아주 하다 미 깨와 토투와데 자고를 해지로 제가 상 건주스미 겹타니 되네 이지로
How is it then that the three jewels can provide protection or refuge? Well, the three jewels are the Buddha jewel, the Dharma jewel, and the Sangha jewel. The Buddha jewel, the founder teacher, he taught the Buddha Dharma perfectly, unmistakably, and in varying ways so as to match perfectly the individual predispositions and karmic backgrounds of his audience. So therefore, he illuminated the path and the path that was suitable to a wide variety of beings. And that the path that he illuminated is how to train one's mind so as to limit the chances of being reborn in the lower realms, increase one's chances of being reborn in the upper realms, and eventually to close the door to rebirth in the lower realms and make it certain that one will only attain rebirth in higher realms. So the Buddha jewel illuminates the path. The Sangha jewel, they are our companions in our training, guiding us in our spiritual development, our day-to-day spiritual friends, spiritual companions. The Dharma jewel, this is what the spiritual aspirant strives to develop within themselves. Eventually they're giving rise to the actual Dharma jewel within their own continuum, true paths and true cessations. And depending to the extent that one nears the attainment of true paths and true cessations, one can even close off the door of possibility to rebirth in the low realms and thereby ensure rebirth in the higher realms. And certainly, when true cessations and paths have been developed, one will only take upper realm rebirth. So this is how the three jewels help one.
anda dene zada konju na gyapsu jobure se dang zo gyamro che se gyamro se di da konju ma zo nga song ge duwa dile gyobe nyuba de suile konju suna yore se gyamne konju suna nga song le ge gyobe ge nyuba di gyamne konju suna yore gyabo konju suna gyobure sembege da yishi duchine 제인데 아 저기 잠바다 시신 된데 되는 제지도 저기 이지지 공부하디 당한 저기 겸도 공부하시고 당한 저기 아 중에 가서 동아리 교배기 뉴버스로 여러 건주스미 열에 제 건주스미 교그리 선비기 야 sem dingne ya ichi jevadi ichi dela 당한저 겸로하시고 데네기 이치데 제주도 이치 코론 데네기 이치 파 셈레 파 원도 규르제 잠바다 시신이게 삼다제 셈찬다 매야지 데네고 동아 타다 데네기 교배 뉴바 접주 군수 교벌이 교배 뉴바 군주스므로 군주스므로 교벌이 삼에 도신 삼모 코론 디자냐 땅되어 공바이나 겸로 공바시고 겸로 공바시지 도시 삼다데
Here in the meditation, one reflects on the qualities of the three jewels so as to generate certainty that they have the ability to provide protection. Through their guidance and our cultivating their guidance within our own continuum, that protection is achieved, refuge is achieved. So this is what we're trying to generate, a deep and heartfelt trust in the ability of the Triple Gem to provide us guidance that leads to protection from suffering. When this is generated in a heartfelt manner through relying on the mental factors of mindfulness and vigilant introspection to ensure that we can investigate with an undistracted mind, and then when we give rise to a feeling of heartfelt conviction and trust, that we abide with that, and thereby strengthen our habituation to that way of thinking. The objects of refuge, these are definite in number. The Sangha jewel, the Dharma jewel, and the Buddha jewels, the Dharma jewel and Sangha jewel. But the way of going for refuge, there is variety here, independent on the capacity of the being. The practitioner of initial capacity, the practitioner of intermediate capacity, and the practitioner of supreme capacity, they all go to refuge to the same three objects, but their way or manner of going for refuge, that differs.
군조 숨디기 누가 나성의 누가래 겹투고래 코의 누가 다달래 겹투고래 안에 semjen 탐제 안에 코의 누가 다달래 겹대 상예살이야 꿰투고르와 나 상예살이야 꿰투고래 타발이야 꿰투고래 사다미고 방래 된저야 꿰투고르와 상 군조 숨디기 지상 군조 숨래야 뉴버 차상 여바제 여래 된저 하다미고 방래 꿰투고래 안에 디 탈바에 탈베고 방래 꿰투고래 네 상지고 방라야 꿰투고래 꿰투고르와 꿰투에 뉴바의 순간에 뉴바 찾아 여대 바래 이내당 안 주기 캡수 조당이 안 주기 삼는 다낭의 토네 다 점절 마선에 숨리고래.
The Buddha has the capacity, or the three jewels rather, the triple gem, has the capacity to provide all forms of protection, provide protection from rebirth in the lower realms, from falling into the lower realms, has the ability to guide the practitioners to achieve protection from the sufferings of samsara in their entirety. So in other words, both the lower and upper realms, as well as having the triple gem has the capacity to provide protection for all sentient beings through the attainment of Buddhahood, and thereby alleviate all sentient beings from suffering.
당한 저기 접수조단데 접수조디 갑라 삼나다달야 나성의 동아디게 삼다제 어떤 나성을 내데 지금 백강아래샤 다 개와치말 하다 미고바 톱내데 톱고구도 제사 니 나성의 동아를 겹제 하다 미고바 토야디 gem려 권주숨기 겹그리 선비게 될야 내내 삼제 개와치말 하다 미 고바점 the Tarbada Tamjiki Samataje, Kiwachimal Hada Mi Kobatam Togudu, Nandrosam Tagudu Sembeki, the Nigga Samataje, Conjusumi Dik, Conjusumi Kyoguri, Sembeda, Hada Mi Kobatoba, the Conjusumi Toba, Jigiri, Sebe, Delet, and Top Tugre, Sembi, Ichicheba in the Ichidi, Camdrodida, Kiwuchuni Camdrosa, DC Horta, Samatana Tone.
Looking at the sufferings of the low realms and generating a strong aversion for such a rebirth, and thinking to ourselves, I don't want to be reborn there. I have to avoid being reborn there. One turns to refuge or for protection to the three jewels, for guidance, so as not to fall into such a rebirth, but to rather accumulate the causes for rebirth as a human or God. Such a refuge is in accordance with a practitioner of initial capacity.
Nganson some sambaje, Nganson Dungari, Hada Milikevene, da Kanga Dua Sempiki, Hada Ngansola Gine, Dunga, Hada Milakine, Azuleta, Yumo, Ongeta, Koala Gine, Dungajan Yeredua, Chizanda, Kovi Dunga, Tarale Tagudu Sempiki, Tarche, Tarbaji Topna Sempiki, Dumbakisha, Taba Tobu, the Deans, Kovi Dunga Tadale, Gyopche, Taro Topiki, Nubadi Sulios, Gemia Conjusum, Yore, Gemia Conjusum Gidi, Gyogri. Korea 동안 타달을 교구리 선배 데레 이치치네 안도치네 이치 제디 겸로 제디 다디 기우 등기 겸로 어서 다가서네 대지 딜에 빼셔라 자체와 차고로 와다.
Practitioner who's progressed from or progressed into the refuge of a being of initial capacity will continue their spiritual development and come to recognize that even a good rebirth as a human or as a God, one still experiences suffering upon suffering. There is no escape of suffering as long as one continues to take uncontrolled rebirth due to previously accumulated contaminated karma. And therefore, merely desiring a rebirth similar to what we have is insufficient. One needs to be aiming much further than that, have a far broader goal, and that is liberation from the sufferings of samsara in its entirety. And here, when the practitioner with sincerity turns to the three jewels for protection from such suffering, for guidance so that one can develop one's mind and thereby attain protection from such suffering, such a practitioner is going for refuge in accordance with the capacity of a being of intermediate capacity.
안델이야다 군을 마선다 당한 주게 랑 대와 되바다 동안을 타고 봐나지 샘제 탐제 대와 되바다 동안 미디어바 지바래 랑 동안을 타고 봐나 샘제 탐제 동안을 타고 샘제 탐제 코웨 동안을 타르시에 안에 땡이 대와디 토고도 인자 샘제 탐제 코웨 동안을 타와데 네 제고도 네 제발라 다 델레기 산지고 봐 톱나다 판도체기 탑 약쇼디 산요고 말이야 샘쟁고 봐 샘쟁 탐지 동안을 줘야지 야 산예설 꿰발라 탑탑럼 약쇼디 산이고 말이 지사다 인장이 샘쟁 탐지게 되는 산요고 봐 토벌 지기 지사 되네자 샘쟁 탐지 산요고 봐 토벌 지지 아니 샘쟁 탐지게 되나래 뭐뭐 가서 샘쟁 탐지 코리 동안 타다 줘 교회 그 뉴버드 술을 겸내 건주스는 요래 샘베이다 장주 샘지 군에 라제 대다 샘제 탐지 코에 동아 타달을 교비 뉴버드 겸내 건주스는 요래 샘이 겸내 건주스는 교구리 샘제 코에 동아를 자 산지고 뭐 코에 투바디 겸내 건주스는 숨나티네 코에 투그레 샘비게다 이치제디 나디 기우 침비 겸로서다 딜레스 군노 야채와지 매바르다 샘제 탐지게 되는 삼다인자 다 딜레 체쇼 군노 야셰쇼인자 니니기 되는 겸로제디다 기우 침비 겸로에서지.
Having progressed through these two intermediate trainings, one takes this realization of the desire, the determination to be freed from the sufferings of samsara in its entirety and applies it to others. Recognizing that there is no difference between myself and others. No one wants to suffer. No one wants to suffer in any way, slight or great. There is really, at a fundamental level, no difference between us. Recognizing this, reflecting on it deeply, one comes to take responsibility for the welfare of others, seeing it as one's own personal responsibility that beings are guided in how to attain their own liberation from suffering, suffering in its entirety. Taking this as one's personal responsibility, one develops it further into bodhicitta, developing the motivation of a bodhisattva, generating the Mahayana Dharma within one's continuum. Here, with this determination to become a Buddha for the sake of others, so that one can be the most skilled of guides, guiding others to attain their own state of freedom, one turns to the three jewels with sincerity, recognizing that they have the ability to provide protection for all beings by helping us become Buddhas. There is no vaster motivation than this, the motivation of the Bodhisattva, the motivation of a practitioner of supreme capacity.
Simchen Tamche Dungala Chago, Simchen Dewa, the Tenkudu, Chisangi, Simchen Tamche, Tiki Tuyata, Dunga Segi, Dalangi, Sengi Chiki, Yazangi, Simchen Tamche, Sanjo Koba, Topache, the Ning Simchen Chisangi, Salia, Kugi, Sempe, Sam Daje, Janjusim Yukuni Lanche, Manzo Kamdo Chevaina, the Niki Kamdo Cheche, Kamdo Chevena, the Niki Kamdo Chibi Kewadi, and then Sangi Koba, Tomatubaina, and 마토와지 신나 가지게 산요 고마 토비토비와 말되니게 심제 탐지게 되나 산요 고마 토비 치르도 겸로 지나네 가르판도 요래서야돼 연구로 와대 심제 탐지게 된다라 산요 고마 토비 치르 군노 장주스미 군내라 겸로 제바이나 세들이야 심제 산요 고마 토마토 나는 소소한 시로나는 아니 가르판도 요래서 배서 제로 연구로 와 진짜 네 말에 되니게 삼녀나 세들이야 산요 고마 토마토 바이네야 데니게 개와디기 안에 안에 탈베토비 탑토도 그래. 그지 타바 토마토 바이나 가지게 되려나 개와치말 하다미고 바 톱토고 나노 기야가. 진짜 샘장 탐 전주 샘기 군내 라제 gem로집에 개와디기 산주고 바토비 규체고 그래. 개와치말 하다미고 바 톱에 톱토야 톱토고 그래. 타바야 디기 톱야지 톱을지고 그래. 진짜 니네 자디나데다 초도 교바데 전주 샘기 군내 라제 권주스만 gem로체데다 초도 교바 체고 그래. 약속돼.
Reflecting on how there is no difference between oneself and others, at a fundamental level we are all the same, wanting to be freed of pain and misery. Developing this further to the point where we take it as our own individual responsibility to ensure that each being achieves a state freed of suffering. This then becomes the motivation to go for refuge, the motivation to turn towards the three jewels for guidance, to ensure that all beings attain freedom from suffering. But within this motivation of the bodhisattva or the aspirant bodhisattva is included the determination for them to spiritually develop so that they can become a Buddha for the sake of others, and thereby within that include freedom from their own afflictions, their own suffering, so that they can be of greatest benefit to others, undistracted or undeterred by their own afflictions. And even within that, at a coarser level, contained within this motivation of a bodhisattva, is the determination not to fall from their track of development, fall into the lower realms, because that will impede their spiritual development and their ability to be of benefit to others. So therefore, within the motivation of the bodhisattva and the aspirant bodhisattva is included the refuge of ensuring that one attains liberation from suffering and a good rebirth as a human or God. So therefore, the bodhisattva motivation is a supreme motivation for going for refuge, because it encompasses all three motivations.
다 점로 공부하는 지금 점로 랍자라고 와다 랍자 갈로서 디봉 개소 타다 주발라서 지산 디봉 개룩치 오래서 디봉 개어 주고 그래서 당한 저기 디봉 개어 줍시도 당한 저기 류가 이수미 디파 파빠야다 마케 게마 줘야 돼 뽕하지 마디 게마 줘야다 게바 녀제 뽕하지 봐 안에 개어 줘야 돼서 아주 류가 이수미 권에 개어 줘봐이나 아니 류가 있음게 독초 아니 미케와디 바가고르와 제가 디봉게도 치고래스 디바 봉고래스 류가 있음게 디바 봉고래스 아니 개와두고래스 류가 있음게 개와두고래스지 도스치네 디봉게서 타다 주발라스.
As individual practitioners, one goes for refuge in accordance with where one is in training. But here, in this part of the text, if one goes for refuge in accordance with the training of a being of initial capacity, then one's determination is to achieve rebirth in the higher realms and to close the door to the possibility of falling into the lower realms in our next life. The training to bring this about then is mentioned in our next line. And enthusiastically practice avoiding negative actions and accumulating virtue. The negative actions to be avoided are the negativities associated with physical behavior, with verbal communication, and our way of thinking. And the accumulation of virtue refers to the accumulation of virtue in relation to our physical behavior, our way of verbally communicating, and our way of thinking. And there's a relationship between these two, that of avoiding negativities and accumulating virtue. Because to the extent one accumulates virtue, it stops the accumulation of the corresponding non-virtue. So as we become ever more virtuous, proportionately, we'll be less inclined to engage in non-virtue.
어디네 자 대시 안송을 깨디 만조날 깨디 규단 낀래 되는 기고래 안 된절을 깨 규단 낀래 되는 기고래서 제사다 만조를 깨 규단 낀데 마음에 와서 그래서 된절 깨 규단 낀데 마 두고 그래서 딕봉스 디바디가선 디바 제발에 되는 가르쳐서 나선을 기고래 저래 나선 깨 규디 디바래 디바래 되는 나선 기고래서 제사 디바를 뽕샤고래 디바 매바 디바 깨 맞주바제 까샤바네 나선기에 유요 말해. 나선기에 유면은 나선기 말해스. 다 개화두고래서. 개화두바나 개화들한테 덴줄이 끼고래. 지상 개화두바네 덴줄기에 유세고래. 유두고래. 지상 되는사 먼저 덴줄 유두바나 아니 제보 영향을 와서 먼저 제보 먹었으나 얘기래. 지상 디봉게도 치고래서. 지상데 산지기 가르송요래서 디버봉고래 개화두고래 산지 랍제 박송샤요와 지난 디네자 산교를 접수주비 산교 람딩 나솔을 교야게 람딩 가르치고선 디버봉고래스 다 덴조라게 탑람 가르송샤요선 개화두고래 산이 디송샤 지난다 디 나저 디봉기로 쳐고래스 된다 디레다.
As is quoted near at the end of the prayer we recite at the beginning of our class in the praise to Buddha Shakyamuni, the Buddha taught, abandon all unwholesome ways of thinking and cultivate all wholesome ways of thinking. So this is what we have here in our final line. Practice avoiding negative actions and accumulating virtue, because it's the negative actions or negative karma that we've accumulated that, should it ripen as a propelling karma at the time of birth, at the time of death, leads to rebirth in the lower realms. Similarly, it's the accumulation of virtue that, should that ripen at the time of death, will propel rebirth in the upper realms. So therefore, we must meticulously guard our mind from all unwholesome thoughts and thereby unwholesome activities, and rather ensure our mind abides in virtue, wholesomeness, because thereby wholesome behavior will follow.
지산 산지의 손샤게디 디바봉거래 개화두포래 산의 손샤바라와 지산단 개능 근처와서 된 안줄이야 남된 지게 취시게 기회 신이라서 받아 안줄 벨 샤벤다메 안주기 출루리스마시베 라마다 게시다 캠보 멍보어래 안디나신 멍보어데 내가도 뼈로 샤벤네 안에 자오름 책이 있네 안에 기디나 밀야 지게 마취제게 냠는 안에 지게 손샤 나디는 진 취제기도 신네 마다취 최대 자위 상에 좀 되는 손샤교디 된마주 공부루를 마시나는 망아들 냠네 되는데 지와서 가지고 랍지 로봇이고 가지고 냠네 안디나시 도시는 다디바도 가지고 통신수교가 야오르미치 도스나야다 아니 가지고 될이야 진행시 가지고 계획주에 서버를 미치기 가지고 최소 做 될이야 가지고 최시하다 냐에 소시도 딩아서 로봇이고 가지고 개와서라 로체거로 지다다 기딩 근처에 가서 로봇에서 베로스마선 니네 시우지고로 와다
let's talk a little further about the Sangha jewel. The Sangha jewel are our companions on the spiritual path. And so one would think primarily of one's spiritual teachers. So one's spiritual teachers will be varied and diverse, any number of lamas, geshes, or khenpos. But let's take, for example, the primary spiritual teacher of His Holiness. Being our spiritual teacher, we receive teachings from him, and we try and implement them, cultivate them in our mind. We hear his advice, follow that advice, both the advice given that is his spiritual teaching, as well as general comments, and we try and live in accordance with them, develop a mind as similar to his teachings as possible. And then we watch his behavior. We see how he interacts with others, and we take that as our role model. And similarly, with other great teachers such as Lama Chöpa, being a teacher of yours, then you receive teachings from him, and you strive to implement them within yourself. The general advice you hear him give, you try and live in accordance with that. And you watch his example, and you try and follow that, aware that that example being set is for his students, and therefore, as his student, is to be followed. So in this way, we recognize how our spiritual teachers, for example, His Holiness and Lama Chöpa, or whoever one's teachers are our companions on the path, are the Sangha jewel.
제반자 당하는 쪽에 예시지 하는 쪽에 개화사이고로 와다 하는 쪽에 개화사이고래 아니 개화사에도 디 개화사주에디 남코는 쪽에 튕긴제 직퇴 그 남된제 도시는 제당하고 로바체로 대라 때는 하는 쪽에 최연시지 하는 쪽에 개화사이고로 제가 개화사에도 디도서 디바도 본거로 와다 이제 제가 디본게로 리고로 와다 제가 개념을 저게 가지고 로체타 두스판에 배천으로 충분히 쉬어도 내가 차고로 와.
If we just look very briefly like we are now at the Sangha jewel, we come to appreciate what they do for us. Because they set the perfect example at all times for us to emulate, to follow. We watch what they do, we see how they teach, both through formally from a teaching throne, as well as through their example. And this is done for us. So therefore, when the opportunity is to receive teachings is offered, we should take that. And moreover, we shouldn't not only embrace the teachings, but we should strive at their integration through meditation, constant reflection. And moreover, by seeing how they live their lives, we should try to emulate that to the extent we can. And in this way, we continuously accumulate virtue, which is what is advised here in this text. Continuously accumulate virtue. And by doing so, we purify the opposite minds, which are non-virtuous. So in this way, our spiritual teachers help us to both accumulate and purify.
디보봉 개와주발이야 안 전발 훈련 제발 진기로 해서 다 디보봉 개루 제대 배준제네 배준제네 정상적인 냠내 제오레스 다데네 진기로 없이도 다데네야 마주기 기고할 하서 남리야 아니기 안지기 동아 마성이 동아 탈래 탈비기 동아 탐절에 타고 대자다 디보봉 개루 지냠내 배수전에 무퇴등의 배수전 지기야 냠는 지기인스 되네기 냠는디 제발이야 안 야고 영하게 안지 냠는디게 야고 영하게 되게 안 지글라미게 진기라버지 에서지 운도신 진기를 없어 뒤주고로 봐.
The way to engage in this accumulation of virtue and abandoning of non-virtue is with great joy, great enthusiasm. We need to have a mind intent on living in accordance with virtue. In other words, having a mind that's always on virtue, that isn't afflicted. This we need an intensity about, but not just an intensity as in focus, but really an enthusiasm and joy. And then furthermore, we turn to our Lama for inspiration, for his blessings, seeking his inspiration that our meditation, both in session as well as how we live our lives, is in accordance with his teachings. Seeking blessings and inspiration that our meditation, our spiritual development, and our accumulation of virtue goes well.
ngāzu dāde mīlū tōp tēnchū yu lūdhīn kāla nē te yore. Nē yōsā, dā ngāzu yu nē, dā jī kiawa chima ngā sōng kī mā kia dā, kiawa chima lhā dā mī kō pā tō yā kī sā kio rō bēsā nē, ngāzu sā kio rō bā, dāde ngāzu kī dā lūngā yu sum yu kō nē, nē ngāzu kī kiawa sā kio rē, dē shī ngāzu kī tuyān tuyān yu dē, ngā yu kō nē kiawa sā wā, nē yī yu kō nē, nē chī kī, 제 군주를 상계를 대바지와다 안철에 돈을 tumba지 이게 개발하고래 나가 저기 최 내가 저 신의시에 다 경화서 년가 년시제 차상 개발해 제가 되는 이제 디술에 된줄게 그 아저 사다 사신 바로
All of us sitting here or watching at home, we have a precious human rebirth, which means we have liberties and endowments, or the leisure and opportunity to ensure that we accumulate causes that will lead to a good rebirth in our next life and close the possibility to falling to the lower realms. And we do this through the accumulation of virtue. Merely listening to this class with its attention accumulates virtue. Me merely giving this class accumulates virtue. So in this way, it can be quite easy to accumulate virtue, and to the quality of one's motivation of that one receives this talk, that to that extent one accumulates flawless causes for good rebirth.
나디기 기부 중요한 남이름 보고 나 송고래 나도 검사ting 아주 같이 와서 다 대시 송바나신 당보 만들 동아데 되는 요래스 비게 동아기 되게 바시 삼다 다 만들래 되게 만들래 야당 아주 하다 미고 와서는 되게 야고 도와서 비게 니니게 야와데 하고 두시 삼르시다 당세외 제일 야당 아주 되게 되디 제바저로 찾고래 다 되는 게 제바전 다내 동안 내래 껴비게 뉴바도 수요래 했으니까 간소가서 겹녀 건주스면 겹투 그래 선비게다 겹녀 건주스면 산여 건주가 남된지 아니 개된 거 지고 조어지 아주 냠는 제바 있나 아니 아주기 대신에 아니 겹투 그래 제가 되는 자다 동안 타달래 되는 게 안던 거 동안 대다 겹비 뉴바 겹녀 건주스면 껴버래 선비게 대바제지도 제제 대바디파 원심이야 예마주바제 방원도 규주에데 전바된 시인이 신진에 제지도 제 공바디 단점도 공바스 좋아 대등 개와치만 안도 동안을 겹제 하다 미고 봐도 gemne 건조 숨는 때는 용투그래 선비게 gemne 건조 숨는 때는 델리게 투브레 선비게 대바제지도 제제 델라 전바다 시신 된제 딩인 제지도 공바이나 단점도 공바스 지금 다 공자디디 잠바 동아 타달래 되니게 껴비 겹는 건주숨 뉴바디 겹는 건주숨 겹는 건주 껴버리 선비게 대바파 온도 규제 잠바다 시신이 된제 온도 규제 다 강강서 같이 검투이나 디스콤바이나 안디 안내가서 조금세 책으로 조금 제지도 겹도 공부하세요 책으로 나 디제라 다 디제라 가슴당 왔으네 나 디니자 다 점주게 랍자 가려서는 디보뽕 개어투바 송거 제사 디니자데 니 디버세데 균이 지금아 선비게 디보뽕기 있으데 디버세 짜오 있는 지금에 세베 디보 충중하는 나 짜오 있는 지금에 다 개와세야 등에 강투도 두기아 선비게 되니게 덤바게제 개와디 간에 두기나 선비게 두치 덤바게제 되니게 덤바데 제지도 내제 양 마야와제 잠바된 시신게 된제 덤바데 개위 동아 디바세 잡아기는 지금에 개와세야디 충충간에나 첨보간에나 류가 유스미 개와데 두기야 선비게다 델리아 둠바텐제 아니 잠바데 시신 텐지도 오시 둠바데 제지도 오시 네토가 공바이나 대항한 저기 점도 공바 차고래 지산디네자 디가서다 점도 공 잡세야디 데넬야 제지도 네제 점돌이야 대바데 이치디 제지도 예제 점바데 시신 텐제 예마여베 곰바데 다 잠도 곰사다 가지고 돈다라 디갑소다 디슌고레 데네자 다 데니고 곰디 냠렌디 약보 용야랴 곰 냠렌 탈침바다 바침모 약보 탈침모 약보 용야데 라미진 라브로시에서야 라말야 안디 제랴 안지 라말야 소딥슈야 디차고레
Summarize then the meditation, and I'll do so in accordance with the practitioner of initial capacity, because it's crucial that in order for the further trainings to go well, that this foundation is properly developed within oneself. So here the first step in the meditation is to reflect on the faults of being, or the sufferings that will follow if born in the lower realms, and the relative benefits of being born in the higher realms, so as to give you a determination not to be born in the lower realms, but to be born in the higher realms. Thereafter, one naturally will give rise to the thought of refuge. Who can protect me from this? And this being the triple gem. And here we reflect on the qualities of each of the three jewels with mindfulness and vigilant introspection. So these mental factors of mindfulness and vigilant introspection one uses at every level of, at every step of the meditation from the beginning to the end. Mindfulness, ensuring that we stay on whatever it is we are meditating on, and introspection, being aware of when we have lost our mindfulness, when we have been distracted, and then mindfulness again, pulling us back, using its capacity of recollection, or its aspect of recollection, to pull us back to what we were reflecting on. So we do that when we're reflecting on the lower realms, and now also on the qualities of each of the three jewels. Then, when we give rise to a feeling of trust, of faith in the three jewels, abide with that. Abide with that. Do placement meditation here. And this should also have been done with the previous step, after reflecting on the faults of the lower realms and the benefits of the higher realms. When the determination arises within you not to be born in the lower realms, don't immediately move on. Abide with that feeling. Strengthen your habituation to that way of thinking. And then move on to reflecting on refuge. So now, having abided on the mind of faith that has arisen, one then comes to the advice of the three jewels, which is accumulate virtue, abandon non-virtue. Here, reflect on the need and how to, and as well as what the entity of non-virtue is. Bring about the determination to not come under the influence of the afflictions, to ensure that thereby that our speech and our physical behavior is not afflicted, but rather is wholesome, and thereby develop the determination to keep our mind wholesome, and thereby our speech and our physical behavior to be wholesome. And also to reflect that afflictions of any magnitude are to be avoided, because they lead to ever stronger afflictions. And likewise, any virtue of any magnitude should be included, because they lead to ever greater virtue being accumulated. And this meditation, the third level, this third step in the meditation, like the previous two, should be done with mindfulness and vigilant introspection. Again, where mindfulness ensures we stay on the object on what we are meditating on, and introspection notices when we have become distracted or we become dull, and then we use mindfulness again to recall the object of meditation, and we continue our analysis. And then when we give rise to a firm and stable determination to guard our mind, ensure we don't come under the influence of the afflictions, to stay wholesome and virtuous, abide with that. Abide with that. Then lastly, so that third step is also included in the refuge meditation. The first step was on the lower realms, and the second and third step, looking at the qualities of the three jewels, and then on their advice, is included in refuge meditation. Now the meditation, as each one does here, all of these verses, concludes with turning to our Lama once again, as we did at the start of the session, for his blessings and making requests that we live our life in accordance with his example, we train our mind in accordance with his teachings, developing all the good qualities that he has within our own continuum. This then concludes looking at the trainings that are shared with a practitioner of initial capacity. So it's just a couple of verses. It's really abbreviated, but this is good to remind yourself of in your daily meditation and do a glance meditation on these. It's important. So if in the last few weeks we're meditating on the qualities of the teacher, and in the last week meditating on the our precious human rebirth, here we come to the meditation for your next week on lower realms and refuge. And next week then, when we gather, we will come to the section on trainings trainings that are shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity. Thank you very much.